everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. My name is Jess Keating. I direct the Notre Dame Office of Life and Human Dignity in the McGrath Institute for Church Life, and I'm just so delighted to see so many wonderful people here to talk about pro-life feminism. Pro-life feminism is often balked at as, in the public square, as kind of an inherent contradiction. People argue that it's just impossible to be feminist and to be pro-life, that in order to be a real feminist, you must support abortion rights. And today's panel is going to explore this. I want to thank especially Campus Ministry for their co-sponsorship and support, and especially our panelists who have carved precious time out of their very busy and full schedules to be with us today. Our program this afternoon will be split into two sort of uneven parts. We'll have a conversation, and the panelists will have a conversation with one another. And then the last little bit, we will invite you into the conversation if you have questions, if you want to offer a comment or ask a question. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and we'll dive right in. We will start down at the other end. Dr. Kristin Collier practices general internal medicine at the University of Michigan Health System. She currently serves as an associate program director of the Internal Medicine Residency Training Program and oversees the program's primary care track. In addition, she is the director of the University of Michigan Medical School program on health, spirituality, and religion. To her left is Abigale Favale, who directs the William Penn Honors Program. It's a great books program at George Fox University in Oregon. Her essays have appeared in The Atlantic and First Things, and her writing has also won several awards, including the Feminist and Women's Studies Association Book Prize in 2014. She just released a memoir this past fall, Into the Deep, An Unlikely Catholic Conversion, and she's also currently a Church Life and Human Dignity Writing Fellow. And last but certainly not least, Charles Camosy is an associate professor of theological and social ethics at Fordham University, where he has taught since receiving his PhD from Notre Dame in theology in 2008. His writing has also appeared in a wide range of sources, both academic and non-academic, including the American Journal of Bioethics, the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He is also the author of several award-winning books, including Too Expensive to Treat, Peter Singer and Christian Ethics, For Love of Animals, and Beyond the Abortion Wars. His forthcoming book, Resisting the Throwaway Culture, will be published next month. He also serves on the board of Democrats for Life and advises the Ethics Committee of the Children's Hospital of New York. Please welcome our panelists. So I'd like to begin, if each of you can tell us a little bit about your background and any important experiences that led you to be a pro-life feminist.
Well, I suppose I was raised a conservative evangelical, and so I grew up with sort of just a pro-life perspective in my home and in my kind of cultural context. And then in college, I became more and more interested in feminism and eventually sort of adopted a pro-choice view for most of my 20s, at which point I had some experiences that led me to both become Catholic and to adopt a pro-life position. So I've been on kind of both sides of the issue, and I can speak, I think it's the next question you wanted us to get maybe more in detail about what changed that view, but I'll just at least give that context that I've sort of had different beliefs on this issue, so I know that it's possible to come with a spirit of goodwill to this topic, even though I now hold different views than I used to.
So I have a little bit of a different experience. So I was raised in a non-Christian home and grew up in an upper middle class family, surrounded myself with friends and mentors and professors who I thought were like-minded to me, progressive, strong people who I think our silent motto would have been, don't let anything stand in the way of what you want to achieve, as long as no one gets seriously hurt in the progress of that. And I never really thought a lot about abortion. I just thought it was a given. I thought abortion was something that we needed to have for women to have equality with men. And I think a lot of us have blinders on to things, either because of ignorance or because it sort of serves our self-interest, but I just didn't really think about it. And if I did think about it, I thought maybe it was unfortunate, but just a necessary evil in the path for women to have a way forward. And so what happened was, over time, I began to have a change of heart about this topic. I became very angry whenever I had people come up to me and challenge my views about abortion. I thought of them instantly as anti-woman or anti-science or anti-progress. One of my neighbors had a very benign sign in her yard that said, "Let's pray to end abortion." And I remember being so infuriated about the sign. And I thought, this woman is so backwards. How dare she? But really, I was the one that had been sold a lie. The lie that I had been sold was that I had to accept the status quo that pits a woman against her offspring in order to achieve equality with men. Another writer has previously said that for women to have liberation that costs innocent lives, that it's oppression redistributed. And so what happened is I became a Christian a couple years ago, but I refused to change my stand against abortion. I knew that my stand against abortion was very antithetical to Christianity, but I dug my heels in. I was like, this is the one thing that I can't give up on. How can I be a self-respecting scientist and a physician and a woman and not totally believe in abortion? This is like part of my lingo. And then I remember one day I woke up and I had this idea that sort of came into my mind that said, like, Jesus doesn't want us killing babies. And I knew that, but I was like, well, maybe this is such a complex issue. Jesus really didn't understand. I understand. I need to continue and dig my heels in, right? So then what happened, though, after that moment, I remember that my heart began to be softened towards what the reality of abortion was. And around that time, by the grace of God, I was able to meet Charlie Camosy. And I remember the first time I met him was about a year ago, and I was still very pro-abortion, and I was at a public dinner, and I was even so mad at him for being a man talking about abortion. I was like, how dare you stand there as a man and talk about abortion? Leave, And he was so kind to me, and he entered in a dialogue over the next several months that was one of openness, and I read his book, and I had a conversion. And now I see abortion for what it really is. It's rooted in violence against women, violence against her baby. The women and healthcare providers who perform abortion are roped into that violence. And I see it now as a part or big picture of a culture that destroys solidarity and really uses a radical form of autonomy to oppress others.
So first, I would want to say, first, what changed my view from being kind of implicitly pro-life to pro-choice. So at first, when I became a feminist, I tried to stay in the kind of pro-life feminist zone. But then I began to read a little bit more and more about pro-choice feminism. And to be honest, I didn't find the arguments compelling. I remember I was working as a secretary in a legal office, and I was reading the Roe v. Wade decision, and I was sort of disappointed by it. I did not find it compelling. But nonetheless, within a few months, I had become emotionally very swept up in a pro-choice position. I remember driving past an abortion clinic and giving the finger out the window at the people who were outside the clinic, just feeling incensed that there was anyone there sort of protesting abortion. And so that conversion to me is very interesting because it was not an intellectual one, but it was an ideological one. Because the more I became sort of absorbed in a mainstream feminist perspective, I basically inherited this kind of pre-packaged set of beliefs, and then those became my own beliefs. In contrast, the switch from a pro-choice position to a pro-life position was very different. One of the most important things that I experienced at the end of my 20s was becoming a mother for the first time. And when I was pregnant with my first child, I had to go have an ultrasound at 12 weeks because there was something wrong with the umbilical cord. And it's not typical to have an ultrasound right at that time. Usually you have one very early and then maybe mid-pregnancy ultrasound. But right at 12 weeks, the child's small enough that you could see their whole body on the screen. And what shocked me was that it was very obviously a complete human being. I mean, I could see his brain, it looked like a cauliflower, it was just fully formed, and he was just kicking around, kicking and kicking and kicking. And this was still in the first trimester, and I was completely floored. At the time, I was professional feminist academic, I had a doctorate, I was pro-choice, as a proper feminist always is, and I had always just assumed, well, of course, in the first trimester, it's not a human being. And so I was just honestly really shocked to encounter the full, unavoidable humanity of my son in the first trimester, just right in front of me. And that became something that really began to shift my views from that point on.
Dr. Collier is not the first person to ask, would I have any business talking about abortion as a man? You may be wondering the same thing as a Pro-Life Feminist Panel. What I often say, and said to her at the time, and say to most people who ask that question is, if the pro-life movement could kick all men out of the abortion debate, we should do it immediately. Because in my opinion, and from the statistics that are available to us, women have better, more nuanced, and more pro-life opinions overall than do men. It's especially the case when we look at women of color and women who are economically disadvantaged. And I studied all this in graduate school and in my own work as a professor, but I've also experienced this in my own life. So you asked us to talk about experiences. I've been really fortunate to have incredibly strong pro-life women form me into the kind of person I am. My mother is one of those people. I learned about abortion from my 5th grade teacher, who was a woman, and I have not changed my mind about abortion since I was a 5th grader and learned what it was. My mentor here at Notre Dame is Professor Maura Ryan, who now works more in administration, but the time I was here was directing dissertations and is a Catholic feminist Christian ethicist and had deep influence on my views in that regard. And then finally, when I went to Fordham for my first job, I was lucky enough to be just miles away from the Hastings Center. Hastings on the Hudson is very close to the Bronx in New York. The first bioethics center that Dan and Sydney Callahan founded back in the 70s. And you may know, and I'll talk more about Sydney Callahan later, but she is maybe the founder of what we've come to understand as pro-life feminism. And so I've been fortunate enough to spend a lot of time just talking with her. She's come to sit in on my classes, to speak in my classes. And so it's mostly as a result of those strong pro-life women in my life that I've come to the views that I have.
Thank you. So pro-life feminism, as I sort of mentioned in the introduction, is sometimes scoffed at as an oxymoron. Why do you think this is?
I mean, I hear that all the time. I've been telling people at my home institution and in my family even that I'm coming to speak on a pro-life feminism panel, and they are like, "Excuse me, what are you talking about?" And I said, "Actually, it's a pro-life feminism panel." And they're like, "You can't be a pro-life person and a feminist. Like, those things are totally contradictory." And then I say, well, who gets to decide? Like, who's adjudicating authentic feminism in this way, and what biases do they have? Show me a pro-choice feminist that believes that women's liberation requires abortion, and I'll show you a pro-life feminist who will believe and show you that abortion is a symptom of violence and oppression, is antithetical to women's liberation. I think when we think about this topic, it's very complex, and I'm the newbie to this game, so everything that I say is all recycled from all these wonderful people that I've been really gifted to learn from. But the progression of a society is really marked by the expansion of human rights, right, to people that formerly don't have them. And I am just blessed and thankful to have my eyes be open to what I've been able to learn about this topic, and I'm just thankful to be here.
I think the attitude that it's not possible to be a pro-life feminism, I think signals to me an attitude in mainstream feminism that reminds me a lot of the religious fundamentalism of my youth. It tends to want to shut down conversation of opposition. It tends to be resistant to scientific information. it tends to be very threatened and really kind of make someone with a different perspective the dangerous other. And so I think that attitude is much more rooted in rhetoric and sophistry than an actual argument. And I think it's to feminism's detriment that that kind of fundamentalism is so prevalent.
I've also experienced that kind of fundamentalism, but I've also experienced some thoughtful pro-choice feminists who see this as a contradiction, in part because they rightly make the case that women for most of human history have had their bodies controlled by the state and by men controlling the state. And I think that's an important impulse to honor, an important concern to honor as a pro-life feminist. But as I think we'll get into a little bit later in our conversation, our abortion regime has not meaningfully moved the needle with regard to those really important issues. So I think it's important to say that there are some places, good places from which that critique comes, but I think the more the issue is studied, the easier it is to see what's problematic about that point of view.
Yeah, Charlie, and you mentioned earlier Sidney Callahan, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the history of pro-life feminism in the United States.
Yeah, so many of you may know that the first wave feminists, the suffragettes, were almost universally against abortion and abortion rights. There was, for my money anyway, a hilarious Saturday Night Live skit about this, where the ghost of Susan B. Anthony came to some modern feminists today and kind of explored some of those contradictions and in an interesting way. But Susan B. Anthony ran as you may know, a magazine called The Revolution, which explicitly refused to have abortion be advertised or talked about in a positive way in the magazine. She wrote it or ran it with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who referred to abortion as infanticide and said, quote, "When we consider that women are treated as property, it is degrading to women that we should treat our children as property to be disposed of as we see fit." Alice Paul claimed that abortion was the ultimate, quote, "the ultimate exploitation of women." We could talk more about first wave feminism. The website and group Feminists for Life has a bunch of documentation you may find helpful if you want to know more about that. There was also a really important response to second wave feminism, which was largely, at least in popular discourse, pro-choice. I have a problem with life choice being a helpful binary, but for lack of a better word, pro-choice. Sidney Callahan was one of the important responses to pro-choice second wave feminism. In fact, when she and Dan founded the Hastings Center, he immediately, in light of the controversy over abortion in the 70s, made his first really big book about abortion. And she says, we talked about abortion every night. It was a nightmare. And she came out largely pro-choice or pro-life from those conversations. He came out largely pro-choice. And she really went to the mat for challenging what she thought was a kind of abandonment of feminist principles in second wave feminism. Another important voice during that time was Mildred Jefferson, who was the first African-American woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School. And she was the co-founder of the National Right to Life Committee and served as its president for 5 years in the 70s. These and other pro-life feminists of that day, I would argue, really drove home the point that the first wave feminists were making, which is there's something about the history of women's being erased from the picture that makes it really problematic for feminists to erase prenatal children from the picture, to not honor their dignity the way that women's dignity was not honored. There's something really profoundly problematic about that. Today, and I'll finish with this, I was just telling John when talking earlier, I just don't think it's even controversial to talk about pro-life feminism and the pro-life movement today. It's almost like on the tips of almost every activist's lips. The major pro-life organizations are all led by women. The March for Life 2 years ago made its focus completely on women and women's dignity. Abby Johnson, who, as you may know, is a former Planned Parenthood clinic director, and her movie Unplanned is playing now. She refuses to talk about abortion at any time without also talking about women, and calls out pro-lifers helpfully, I think, for often talking about the disembodied fetus apart from the relationship with the woman. So there's been a progression, but it's always been there, and I think we're now at a very exciting time in that history.
Charlie, just a quick follow-up question. Abby mentioned rhetoric a bit earlier, and you've been talking about a little bit around the question of rhetoric. How do you see our rhetoric in the United States as helpful and unhelpful in these conversations?
Well, abortion, despite my very strong pro-life views, I think we do the issue a disservice if we don't acknowledge its complexity. There are, as I tell my bioethics students, about 17 positions you can actually have on the issue, depending what aspect you're focused on. So at a very bottom level, the life choice binary doesn't work for helping, as a rhetorical tool for getting at what people think about abortion. Just one quick statistic to show that. If you ask people via Gallup what they think about abortion before 12 weeks, 6 in 10 US Americans want it broadly legal. If you ask them after 12 weeks, 7 in 10 want it broadly illegal. Is that a pro-life position, a pro-choice position? The binary just doesn't work. But I see that binary antagonistic way of thinking about the issue all the time. Like, either you're a feminist or not a feminist. You're either for life or you're for choice, or you're religious or you're secular, or something like that. And I guess what I try to get across, even though I come down pretty firmly in a pro-life position, I think one thing that pro-life feminism does is really take into account some of the complexities that our rhetoric misses.
Thank you. Kristin, we've had some events recently on campus, a screening of Netflix's Reversing Roe, and the suggestion that abortion is a procedure that brings a woman back to baseline. And I was wondering if you could speak to this as a doctor and a little bit more about the complex relationship between a woman and her developing child.
Sure. I mean, this is a topic, this is totally in my wheelhouse. I could talk about this for forever and ever, but just to give you guys a brief glimpse into the beauty of this. So we all know that we are interconnected, interconnected in ways that are very obvious, but interconnected in ways also that are a bit of a mystery. But the mother and baby are interconnected in ways that are really profound and just being started to be understood a bit. So on the macro level a bit, the placenta is a beautiful example of this I just want to talk about for a bit. So the placenta, as you guys know, is the organ that connects the baby via the umbilical cord to the wall of the uterus. And the placenta is the only organ that's made by two people. So the baby and mom actually build the placenta together. It's the first time that the baby and mom cooperate in putting something together. And so the placenta actually is a fetal-maternal organ. It's transient because it doesn't stay, right? It's delivered. And it's amazing because it's built by two people in this beautiful cooperation with the help of God, but it also acts as many organs in one. So the placenta is the baby's kidneys, the heart, the circulatory system, the endocrine system, the immune system. It's just amazing. And then on the micro level, there's actually radical mutuality at the level of our cells. Okay, so this is like crazy, but if you think about this concept of something called microchimerism, so in science, microchimerism is the presence of a small population of genetically distinct, separately formed cells that are in your body. And so what happens actually when you're pregnant, fetal cells enter the maternal circulation through the placenta, and those cells stay in the mom's body, you guys, and help the mom like for decades to come. It's amazing. So this is like a newer area of research, and they're not entirely sure of the purpose of all these microchimerisms, but they think that these cells lodge in tissues where mom may need some help. So for example, they think that these cells, that these baby cells actually may help protect the mom against breast cancer. They've been found to lodge in sites of injury, so these fetal cells will lodge in like a defect from a cesarean incision and help to form collagen to help mom heal. I mean, it's like mind-blowing that even at the level of our cells, that there's like an interconnectedness and a relationality there that's really quite beautiful. So you never return back to some other baseline or a previous baseline. You wouldn't want to. Actually, pregnancy changes you in a way that's very profound.
Thank you. We've talked about this a little bit already, but one of the central charges sort of levied against pro-life feminists is that the pro-life movement oppresses women. How do you respond to this in conversation with people who bring this up?
Women are making choices in these social constructs that have been made by privileged, powerful men, right? And the choices that they make are rewarded by this system, and there is not freedom there. That's like a strategy that's employed, and that if you think about the social constructs that are made by men, they're being made by men who are people by their biology who cannot bear children. And so if we think about reclaiming a space for women's biology that honors our amazing power for reproduction and to honor our future sisters and brothers, we must remake these social constructs to honor the dignity of women and our biology and our differences. And so we need the powerful witness of men and women who refuse to accept the status quo on abortion and fight for women to be able to make a choice, to promote and to choose life. And that means having paid leave for women students, paternity and maternity leave, to have childcare, to fight against harsh discrimination and hiring practices so that women are more apt to choose life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the crux of the matter is that an abortion-embracing feminism carries within it an implicit masculine bias, an ironic kind of masculine bias, because the idea is that in order to be empowered or free, a woman must make herself as much like a man as possible. So instead of trying to really adapt our culture to the reality of female biology and the possibility of pregnancy, we've instead asked women to change their bodies in ways that are often violent in order to adapt to a masculine norm in which one cannot be pregnant. So this creates a war between women and their bodies. It makes fertility a threat. You can even see this implicit idea in some of the kind of language about, say, a woman who, through consensual sex, becomes pregnant against her will. Well, what is the thing that's making a woman pregnant against her will? It's her body, right? Assuming, of course, that she has sex consensually, right? So this really pits women's bodies against themselves. And in kind of the history of feminist thought, I think you can see this idea maybe in its seminal form in The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, which is a very influential text in Western feminism. And I think it very much shaped the second wave, especially in American feminism, because Betty Friedan was very much influenced by Simone de Beauvoir. And Simone de Beauvoir, I mean, it's a brilliant book. She has some great things to say, but also it's very clear when you read her account that she really sees female biology as what enslaves women. And so she creates a vision of freedom where what it means to be free is to fight as much as possible against the facticity of female biology. So that introduces a paradox at the heart of feminism, if that's your feminist perspective. So I think that, in fact, there's more sort of philosophical inconsistencies on sort of a pro-abortion feminist view than a view that tries, in fact, to consider the good of a woman both in harmony with her fertility, her ability to be pregnant, and her ability to be a mother.
And Charlie, you sort of wrote the book on this, or at least a chapter.
Yeah. That was beautifully said. I'd add just one thing that we talk about in bioethics, which is called the pathologizing of pregnancy, or the disease model of pregnancy that goes along with this notion. So rather than a celebration of a specific power for women, it's in a patriarchal context, it's thought of as a burden, as a pathology, as a disease to be mitigated. And that seems very clear in the Supreme Court ruling Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which you may know was actually the replacement case for Roe versus Wade. People talk all the time about Roe being overturned. I don't know if it's snarky to say, but I always like to say Roe has already been overturned. Planned Parenthood versus Casey has replaced Roe versus Wade. And one remarkable passage from Planned Parenthood versus Casey said, the ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by the ability to control their reproductive lives. Of course, control their reproductive lives is just talking about abortion. That's what the case is about. And pro-life feminists, I think overwhelming majorities of pro-life feminists hear something like that and say, where is the oppression coming from, actually? If women are pitted against their prenatal children in this way, if literally pitting them against their prenatal children is required for their economic and social equality, that's oppressive. That's offensive. And we ought to do better in ways that Dr. Collier were talking about in terms of providing things like paid family leave and equal pay and a living wage and affordable childcare. And those are things, again, that pro-life feminists have taken the lead on.
We live in a really polarized country. I'm wondering what role you see for pro-life feminism in an increasingly polarized electorate, an increasingly polarized political sphere.
Well, I think one of the helpful things about pro-life feminism is that it cuts across those polarities. If you're a pro-life feminism, at times you are going to disagree with conservatives. You are going to, at times, disagree with liberals. You are not going to be able to fit neatly into the political categories and polarities that are often set up in our culture. And I think that's actually very helpful, right? Because I don't think either of those boxes really has the best sort of perspective on how to deal with a lot of these issues. And I think then the role of sort of pro-life feminism is to make sure that this kind of conversation is happening, and to show, I think, especially young women who are increasingly and for good reason interested in feminism, that it is possible to, in good faith and with very good reasons, to be a pro-life feminist. You don't have to sort of accept the kind of dogmatic imposition of a pro-abortion position. And so I think in that way, pro-life feminism plays a very important role in shaping the consciences, particularly of women, because, as Charlie mentioned, abortion is complex, and a woman does have a unique kind of power over the very vulnerable life of her unborn child. And so the most important thing I think pro-life feminism can do is to actually help shape the consciences of women themselves, and to show them a path in which they don't have to be afraid of their own biology, and they don't have to sort of suppress that biology in order to be free.
Yeah, I think as I've found, being a pro-life feminist brings some heat, because you're considered a troublemaker, because you are, thought of as someone who's trying to shake up established binaries or, have difficult conversations. But we know that we just are trying to fight for the rights of our future sisters and brothers, and have conversations to bring light to the fact that these are people, and that we should use the voices that we have to speak for those who are voiceless. And who is one of the most voiceless, marginalized populations in this country is the prenatal child. So it's important to have these conversations with our friends and family. And as I've learned, as I was that person who was on the opposite side of it, especially people like Charlie have taught me to enter into these conversations with a sense of solidarity with one's conversation partner, and a sense of humility and respect, and also always talking about what we're for, and not what we're against in these conversations. But they're important to have, especially in these times of political tribalism.
I care quite deeply about trying to mitigate polarization. I think it's a great place for the Catholic Church in the United States to live, frankly, and be leaven and salt and light. But on this particular issue, there's just so many interesting things that could happen, but in light of polarization, largely are a struggle to make happen. One of those is just working together to make our social structures more hospitable to women who want to choose to keep their children. For people who are pro-choice and not pro-abortion, that is common ground with pro-lifers that should be fairly obvious. But our political left-right polarization really hurts our ability to get those things done. And it's not just from the so-called pro-choice left, it's from the small government pro-life right as well. So my book was negatively reviewed in National Review precisely for that reason. I was making all these big government proposals that they didn't want to get behind. So it's really a historical accident that the pro-life movement is even associated with the small government right. It was a very particular political moment in the late 70s and early 80s, and we're really well past that moment. In our current culture, it's not even clear what moment we're in, which is actually a hopeful thing, I think, for this kind of polarization. We can maybe actually move the needle in ways, creative ways, that we weren't able to a generation ago, precisely because we don't really know what's going on at the moment.
Thank you. Before we open it up for questions, I have one last question for you. For this group of young people who are here today, what words of advice would you give them as they go out into the professional world as potentially pro-life feminists?
I mean, I think we all here are in a very special spot of privilege to be able to have education and various platforms to which to speak. That could be speaking with our roommate, our neighbors, our sisters, our brothers about this topic. I think in the professional space, I can speak as a physician about how this has practically come to light in my practice. Since becoming a Christian, my faith has really informed my practice in a way that has been very sustaining for me. I see my patients now made in the image of God, and I see this as a sacred vocation that I'm in as a physician. And I see now a pregnant lady, and I see two people there, and I didn't before, and I'm ashamed to say that, but I see two patients, I see two people. I take care of mostly women as a primary care doctor, and the physician-patient relationship often has the nature of like a confessional relationship, and people confess things to me as they would to, I would almost imagine, a priest, in a way, because they tell me things they don't tell other people. And a lot of women have told me about their experience with abortion and how they really felt it was an unchoice for them, and they were coerced, or they didn't really feel like they had other options. And there's no response that should be given to those women except mercy and compassion and love. We should be able to see the face of Christ in them, and they should see the face of Christ in us in these conversations. So when you encounter women who had abortion, they should be encountered in this way. When I think about my learners, my medical students in particular, speak very passionately around social justice and vulnerable populations and people on the margins and oppressed persons. And they love this language, and I love it too. It's truth, and it's what's important. But what's interesting is that they don't seem to include the prenatal child in this sphere of concern. So I always am trying to challenge them. When you think about vulnerable, oppressed populations, voiceless persons, how can we include, or why aren't you including the prenatal child in your sphere of concern? Can we talk about this? These conversations happen in the context of a relationship, and I'm very grateful to have relationships with my students, and we're trying to have these conversations on a larger scale at Michigan with the program that I oversee. So I think those are some of the ways that it's practically mattered, and if you're thinking about a pre-health career, I'd be happy to talk to you too about what this looks like more practically, either in the clinical education or research space, in more of a practical way.
Yeah, I think Kristin brings up a really important point. In naming the inconsistency between a lot of the ethos of feminism in terms of empowering those who are vulnerable and marginalized, but then how that seems to be very inconsistent with excluding an unborn person from the sphere of concern, like Kristin points out. Because I really think that it's true that the argument that the vulnerable can be violently sacrificed for the sake of maintaining control is not a feminist argument. In fact, I think it is contradictory to the heart of what feminism should stand for. So I think one thing that's needed in our time is intellectual freedom. Women, to be free, need to be intellectually free. So I encourage my students to resist kind of ideological groupthink, to not simply just accept a sort of prepackaged platform of ideas, but to really think deeply about these complex issues and to pay attention to philosophical consistencies in particular. And also then to be to have moral courage, to have fortitude, to be okay with being a troublemaker, like Kristin said. It's okay to be a feminist who's a little heterodox when it comes to this issue, and to not be afraid of going against the grain and changing the conversation.
So I was an undergrad here as well, and I did my undergrad work in analytic philosophy of religion, and I was all about arguments, premises, conclusions, and that's how I initially went into thinking about abortion. Like, it's all about arguments and evidence. I still think for some people it is. I think for most people it probably is not. And I've come to see, especially my activism, opposed for making arguments in an academic context, to be more about telling stories, drawing attention to people, and creating an opening for God, frankly, to work in their lives. Almost no one is argued into a position on abortion. And I mean almost, I think there are some, but almost no one. And so, for instance, just to give one example of this, when Sydney Callahan came to my bioethics classes, I would constantly, after she visited, get people come to office hours, write me emails, wanting more information, often about the very things we had just talked about 2 weeks ago. But because they had encountered a person that they were moved by, it just took on a different way of affecting them. And so if I had one way to encourage pro-life feminists in this regard, it's tell stories, engage people personally, and maybe we can take our foot off the gas when it comes to actually trying to argue people into positions.
Hi. So I know we talked about how pregnancy can often be pathologized, and we can try and force women into being more physiologically like men by encouraging abortion. But regardless, even with pregnancy being a natural part and a synergistic part of a woman's life, it is dangerous. And often when people start talking about the danger of abortion and compare it with pregnancy, like, that's when the conversation shuts down, because it's not comparable in that pregnancy is very dangerous at times and has a lot of risks and demands a lot of sacrifice. And so I just was wondering how you would respond to people who bring that up, as well as how we can ask that of women to make that sacrifice. Thanks.
So what you hit on there is one of the issues that I think I know I had in mind when I was trying to discuss the complexity of the issue. So I think I know every pro-lifer I've ever met wants an exception to save the life of the mother. They disagree about what that means. Can it be a direct abortion, an indirect abortion that only foresees the baby's death but doesn't intend it? So there's that. If there's an indication that the pregnancy threatens the life of the mother, that is an uncontroversial position within the pro-life movement. The only controversy really is about what can we do and what is indicated medically and ethically when that's the case. When it comes to health, as you may know, there's a wider range of views about that question. And the fact that, as you rightly point out, pregnancy threatens every woman's health, at least in a moderate way, complicates that question a lot. And that really gets into one of the things I try to get my students to understand, is that we need to spend a lot of time on the ethics and morality before we jump to public policy, because policy is different than talking about ethics and morality. And if we're going to have, say, a health exception, it becomes very difficult to put that into policy in a way that reflects people's intuitions about these cases. I don't think most people I talk to, including pro-choice people, most pro-choice people I talk to, I don't think people have morning sickness in mind when they talk about health, for instance, but something way more serious than that doesn't quite rise to the level of threatening her life, then people's views change on that question. I tried to write a book that wrestled with some of these issues. It's not a soundbite type question that I can answer in a soundbite. But I think any person coming to these issues that doesn't wrestle with that question, especially as a matter of policy, has really missed an important level of the complexity.
I think also to add to that, I think that's exactly right. And I'm not, in what I'm about to say, I'm not at all sort of minimizing or denying the fact that there can be great sort of risk in pregnancy, especially in extreme situations. But at the same time, I do think there is an undue fear that is inculcated around pregnancy, particularly for young women, as if one couldn't handle an unplanned pregnancy. So on the one hand, I do think, I often have students who come in and say like, well, what happens if I get pregnant in graduate school? As if that is an insurmountable obstacle. And I try to affirm them, you can have a successful career and be a mother. Those things are compatible, right? So I'm talking here about sort of normal pregnancies, normal and healthy pregnancies. So I think that is also helpful. And then there has to be a commitment on the part of someone who is pro-life to creating social support for women who are in particularly unplanned crisis pregnancies. And I think local efforts, we've talked a little bit on the national level, I think local efforts are incredibly important. So getting involved with relief nurseries, if you have anyone in your church communities or in your family, making sure that you are very much supporting in a very material way and very physical way women who need extra support in order to handle a pregnancy. I think that's also incredibly important. But I do want to fight against, and I'm not saying that your question went there, but there is a danger, I think, in that attitude kind of almost becoming a sort of paternalistic concern about protecting women from themselves and the possibility of pregnancy that I think sometimes is a little problematic in and of itself, just as an attitude.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I have a question for Dr. Collier. Yeah. As a pregnant woman, for the first time, I have both deepened my views as a pro-lifer, but also have more understanding of why someone would choose abortion, because it stinks to be pregnant sometimes. Yep. So I'm wondering what you think that science can offer, and specifically in medicine and physicians, what you can offer to women, because my experience is we can't assume that a doctor is pro-life. I had to find a pro-life doctor. So, what's missing, and what do you think science can offer to advance the pro-life cause?
So, a couple things. So I have 4 children. I have 4 little boys, and I understand how hard pregnancy can be. And my 4 pregnancies were challenging in all very different ways. And I agree with you that having a baby, as Abigale has also said, has really deepened our understanding of what this topic is all about. With regards to your question around science, I think if I'm understanding what you're saying, I think that there are a couple things. I think science is amazing and wonderful, but I'm not sure that science has all the answers that we're looking for in this conversation. I think we have to have conversations with our friends in philosophy and theology and social work and nursing and in the pastorate to be able to have a bigger, fuller view of what's at stake here. So as a science person, it's rare for me to say that this isn't maybe a science-anchored type of focus. I think what science could provide is, maybe I gave a micro example of this earlier in my discussion of microchimerism in the placenta, is the deeper we go actually into the science, because God is the author of biochemistry, I mean, this is his science that we're discovering, it just gets more and more and more amazing. So when I think of Psalm 139 about how we are fearfully and wonderfully made, my science education now in that framework has exploded my idea of what that even is all about. And I think, science, we could do more in science, those of us who have a faith-based anchor, to be vocal about this majesty that we see, because it really illuminates the beauty of the baby and what's at stake. But I think for a fuller picture, the conversations have to be made with our friends in these other departments as well.
Hello, thank you so much for the beautiful conversation that you guys have been having with us. I am actually interested in the idea of challenging the feminism piece. I have been traditionally a pro-life feminist the last I don't know, 5, 6 years or so of working in the pro-life movement, and I have found that as I am also a mother of 4, I come up against like the challenge of asking women to do everything, which to me, pro-life feminism kind of puts that forward as like you can be both a mother and like this really intense professional and an academic, and you can do everything that you want to do, and there isn't necessarily a sacrifice you have to make. And I think that that's really a dangerous position as well. I think like sacrifice is probably at the heart of both questions, right? Like the sacrifice of the woman to have a child is so immense and huge that it needs to be acknowledged as such, and that there needs to be a space carved out for women to say, I don't actually have to do it all. I could just choose to be a mother, and I'm a PhD, and I can actually sacrifice my career as a mother and be just as self-respecting as a woman. And I think that's like a really important piece. I don't know if you guys, especially as female, successful, top of your career sort of people could speak to that, but I think I've found myself questioning more and more how to be a feminist effectively as like a really devoted mother.
Yeah, I think I love everything you just said, and I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at a little bit earlier with this idea that we somehow need to protect women from heroic sacrifice, which I don't think that we need to do. Instead, I think we sort of need to affirm that that's often what motherhood entails, and that there's a deep sort of meaning to that. I mean, theological or otherwise, that I think is really important. And earlier when I said, you don't have to sort of forgo a career to have motherhood, I think that's true, but I also don't think it's possible to have it all, right? I mean, you make sacrifices, you do, and I think I do have a career, but for me the most important thing is my children and being present to them, right? And so I also make sacrifices to be apart from them in order to provide for them, which is its own kind of sacrifice entailed in motherhood. So I think you're definitely right, that there's a danger to saying, oh, women can just sort of do everything without having to sacrifice, which is simply not true.
So we're thinking about the way that our culture has been structured around patriarchal, consumerism-driven sort of model. Sort of the way that women are defined of what women are for is what basically privileged men have decided what everyone is for, basically to work a ton to sort of produce and consume in a consumerism model. And for people that want to buck that patriarchal system, they're oftentimes shamed, and oftentimes they're shamed by other women. And so I think these conversations are important to have, men included, but also with women, about sort of, can we embrace a broader reality of what women's choices are to be a stay-at-home mom or to work, to have children, et cetera. And I think this idea of sacrifice, oftentimes we look at sacrifice as like a bad thing. Oh, I have to sacrifice. Like, sacrifice is a beautiful thing. Can we reclaim sacrifice actually as a profound, wonderful, beautiful thing? And have conversations that are real about how hard life is. Am I like the only one that thinks it's like so hard to have like kids and like brush my hair? Like, because if you don't talk about it, everyone thinks everyone's so put together. We're like one step away from like being a hot mess, right? So I think having like conversations with our women in a community of support and supporting women in our broadest sort of form, I think that's how we reclaim some of this, but it has to happen in neighborhoods and communities and families and churches. But I love what you're talking about, because I understand that it's a complex issue.
Thank you. Very wonderful, helpful. I have 2 questions, and before you have to like figure out where I'm coming from, like you always do in pro-choice things. I'm in the mushy middle. Started pro-choice, became a Catholic. Can't get pro-life, can't stay pro-choice. It's complicated, right? With you, but 2 things, and I come at this understanding, perhaps wrongly, but from the statistics out there, that the people who get abortions are disproportionately poor, disproportionately people of color, and quite often already have children. So we tend to think of them as like people, right? So there's 2 questions, and these are not ethical questions. One's a political question, if you will, and one policy. The political question is, under the circumstances, isn't it important for the pro-life movement to take up issues of maternal mortality, given the profound disparities between poor women and rich women, and parts. You know what I'm talking about. It's like a third world country if people haven't seen that. So that seems to me, I don't see how you talk about abortion without talking about that personally. So it's just me telling other people what to do since I'm not an activist. And the other question is if you will, a policy question, right? Given the fact that people are not, I mean, some people may have abortions because it's convenient, but a lot of people are having abortions because they're way on the edge, right? They don't have the money necessarily to support the kids they have. So ethically, yeah, don't we all have to go out and try to make these policies change, but they're not going to change for the people who are here pregnant now. And you can tell them, give up your baby for adoption, but precisely because you bond with the baby, people don't. So how do you then tell people, don't have an abortion when they're on the edge? And I mean, I don't mean individual people. When they're on the edge, the services are not there, and they're not coming, for 18 years. That's my question.
It seems clear from the statistics you outlined and the ones I've researched that it's really important to call abortion the unchoice for the kinds of women that you just described. I'd also add, in addition to just saying yes to everything you said, if you ask rich white people what they think about issues like that, they think, well, that means that abortion should be largely legal, maybe even always legal, regardless of what trimester we're talking about. If you talk to poor people of color, they generally are more skeptical, even if they identify as pro-choice. Another reason the life choice binary does not help. They are generally more skeptical than privileged white people are. And if you could break it down even further, though, people who are poor, economically vulnerable, and who are people of color have more abortions proportionately than do privileged white people. If you break it down by unintended pregnancies that end in abortion, they actually have fewer, proportionally speaking. So it would really, the pro-life feminist message seems to be almost like tailor-made for this population, to say like, we hear you, you don't have the resources, and we're going to work our best to change that. But we also hear you when it comes to you wanting abortion to be less widely available. And there really isn't a political constituency for that right now, at least right now. I again think things are pretty hopeful in our current place of confusion. But I just wanted to add that to your very good comments. I think that kind of I like to call it hashtag choose both approach, is really in line with what some people are calling intersectional analysis of this question. And I'm quite frankly disappointed that we haven't had more intersectional analysis of abortion from the perspectives we've been talking about today. It seems to be one of the issues that has eluded that kind of intersectional analysis.
Last question to Maddie.
Hi, thank you guys so much. This was like amazing. One of the things that I've come up in conversation with some of the people that I know that are more on the pro-choice spectrum is when you talk about it kind of, when you get to the heart of the issue, it ends up being kind of a pairing, you're facing two rights. You have the right of the unborn child to life and the right of the woman and her autonomy and that right to choose. And that seems like to be a sticking point where, and a lot of my friends will be like, well, I'm a feminist, I believe that the woman's right trumps that. And so how would you respond in those situations where to women that are coming from that angle of like an abortion embracing feminism, that is an exercise of right and that should there should be a hierarchy there of that right. That's one thing that I've come up in conversation, and I'm wondering if you could kind of address that. Thanks.
I think one of the problems I see with that line of thought is that the concept of personal autonomy seems to be modeled on a male biological reality. And so already you've kind of shot yourself getting out of the gate. I remember a couple years ago when I was beginning to go through the throes of trying to figure out what I thought about this issue, seeing a Facebook post from someone who I didn't know. It was just one of these things that got shared and shared. And she said that the Facebook post basically said, I I'm pregnant for, this is the second time I've gotten pregnant on long-term hormonal birth control. And I'm choosing to have an abortion, because I'm not in a position to become a mother at this time of my life. And I'm sharing this publicly because, bodily autonomy exists for a reason. And what struck me when I read that was how the very experience she's describing shows that bodily autonomy does not exist in the same way for women as it does for men, and in fact had to be sort of violently enforced on her own person. So I think that we are peddling a myth or a misunderstanding of what freedom looks like that already penalizes women just for being women from the beginning. So I think our understanding of what freedom and autonomy are from the get-go need to shift. They need to accommodate the reality that a pregnant woman does not fit into the very phenomenon of pregnancy undermines the kind of autonomy and the neat sort of separation of this right from this right that you're describing. And so I think that was one place I would start the conversation, is just that framework is problematic from the beginning.
And to get to say something else about the intersectional discourse, that impulse is very strong within intersectional discourse today, right? There are people who are allies to each other when it comes to systemic oppression. Instead of using the kind of autonomy language or disconnect language, try to see about how all these things are interconnected. How is the oppression that a prenatal child is facing is actually connected or intersects with the oppression that a woman or a mother is facing. So again, it's just not the current moment, our current intersectional moment, our current feminist moment, just really bucks this very patriarchal notion of autonomy as like separating these two individuals in a way they ought not be separated.
So friends, we've come to the end of our hour, and we've worked our panelists pretty hard. So let's give them a round of applause.